So this morning, we will have a presentation of the first draft of what we're calling a black paper. We're Pan-Africans, we're in the home of the Black Star, so very fitting as a title. This session presents a black paper, which is a Pan-African decolonial framing of Africa's economic transformation. The paper addresses Africa's development from a political economy ideological framing and situates the role of debt, the role of illicit financial flows, and other economic factors that undermine the continent's transformation pathways. Maybe not in this draft, but we will all make sure that it is actually underpinned in a feminist analysis if I have anything to do with it. This paper is developed under the stewardship of the Stop the Bleeding campaign, and Dawn Dea yesterday took us through who the 7 organizations that sit under the umbrella Stop the Bleeding campaign and have been working for quite a number of years on different economic campaigns. It started off as a tax justice campaign. We're now focusing on debt for the next few years, and beyond that, we will be figuring out together where we land. So this black paper really provides a new roadmap for the discourse in Africa and Africa's development finance. To present the paper, we have with us today Professor Bokpin. He's a lead consultant and will be presenting highlights, emerging issues, and gaps in the paper. I am going to invite Professor Bokpin to come up and join me. And as I do, I will introduce. He's a professor of finance and an economist with over 20 years of experience in industry, government, and with multilateral institutions. His work focuses on the intersection of accounting, of finance, and of economics. He's recognized globally for his research on Africa's economic structure, Africa's governance, debt, and inclusive growth. Welcome, Prof.
So I'll give you a bit of introduction. The colonial legacy, even though we see Africa broadly has gained independence, in essence, we have not. The same structure, the strategy they put in place from 18th century thereabout, we are still practicing that and following that if you look at the flows or if you follow the money. And then we look at the new form of colonization. We call it new form of colonization, which comes in the form of debt and trade diplomacy, right? So typically we say in finance, the word bonds, as in like issuing bonds, and bondage are from the same family word. Okay, so that's a new kind of colonization that we have observed, essentially given the flows in terms of the high cost of servicing our debt, which leaves the continent practically with nothing for development spending. And then we also look at the inequality that is also influenced by the legacies of colonization, and then how that also affects women empowerment on the continent. And then we look at natural resource governance, which is strongly linked to illicit financial flows on the continent, where our conclusion, like others have estimated, is that Africa is perhaps the only continent where water flows upwards, not downwards. We agree with all what has been said because, and again, if you look at the economic structure that had been handed over to us, even though we have been in charge in the last 60 years or so, essentially is the same economic model we are practicing, which only was designed to serve the rest of the world as producers of primary commodities. And to date, we have added very little to those primary commodities, and a lot of the illicit financial flows, you can associate them with weak natural resource governance on the continent. So what you see here is the African map without Africa. So when I say the African map without Africa, this is just to tell you what happened in somewhere 1884, 1885, during the Berlin Conference, where the Europeans decided to share Africa as a cake among themselves in an organized way. There's a way to do looting in an organized way. So that was essentially what happened. And interestingly, if you read the story, you will notice that that Berlin Conference, the concept note that also triggered that didn't come from politicians. It actually came from the Hamburg Chamber of Commerce, essentially, that wanted Europe essentially to colonize Africa for the purposes of eliciting as much wealth as they could, and we'll try to understand that. So you can see the likes of Italy, British, Germany, and all of that. So this is the African map without Africa. But again, even though we can insert African countries in this map today, essentially the legacy left is what we are rehearsing largely to a large extent. So then again, we notice that African geopolitics and conflicts are also linked to the colonial legacy as well. So essentially, part of the conflict geopolitics we see here is the case of the colonial masters who have left, but they are still here. Right? So they left, but they are still with us here in one way or the other, influencing our governance, influencing our economic decisions and all of that. So we can't say that really we have gained economic independence to that extent. Okay? So Africa is still stuck with colonial legacies. That is a story. And if you look at the way Africa was demarcated and redesigned from 1883 thereabout, Africa wasn't designed to serve Africa. So we should not be surprised if Africa is not serving Africa, because those who designed Africa, in terms of fiscal activity and all of that, didn't design Africa to serve Africa. So if we want Africa to serve Africa, then we have to redesign Africa to serve Africa. We cannot continue to use the same model they used for centuries and expect that that same model will serve us because we are in charge. So we just have to look at how we remodel this going forward. Then again, you also see that across Africa, our legal investment laws, FDI-related laws, are closely aligned with colonial legacies. So countries that were colonized by Francophone or English or Germany have laws, have investment treaties, legal framework that are more aligned to those countries that colonized us, and some of those laws still sit in our books today, right? And that is what we are using in 21st century. Okay. So that is another thing, that if we want to reframe Africa, we should be looking at the legal framework, we should be looking at the institutional arrangements, redesign them to serve Africa. You just can't pick something somebody has designed to serve them and expect that by being in charge, certainly it will serve you the way you expect it. So I think those are the things that we want to be able to highlight as part of this work. Of course, we also know what colonization has done for us in terms of it essentially redesigning our socio-economic structure through the colonial dominance, exploitation, and imperialism between the 1800s to 1960. And this is evidenced by cheap labor. Essentially, in economics, if we talk about factors of production, you want to increase output, you are looking at labor. They got cheap labor, extremely cheap, right? And then they got natural resources, they got all that they wanted and all of that. But the other thing that we also noticed was that colonization actually changed our economic structure from food sufficiency to more food dependence. Because part of what they did was to substitute our food crops for cash crops, essentially to feed growing industries in Europe and North America. So what happened was that we stopped producing what we will eat ourselves and rather produce what we can sell for money. And to date, Africa has remained food dependent to the rest of the world. And in 2015, Africa's net food import was more than $35 billion. And by the end of this year, Africa's net food imports will be more than $110 billion. It's the only continent that is failing to feed itself. Meanwhile, that same continent has almost 60% of the world's unused arable land, and the two largest and the two longest rivers are all located in Africa. So we are capable of feeding ourselves and the rest of the world, and you can understand why Europe and the rest of them would design agricultural policy with Africa in mind. Because if you look at consumption expenditure across the continent, it is only in Africa that we spend approximately 44% of all household expenditure is on food. Right, 44% of all household expenditure is on food. In developed countries, it's just around 6%. In emerging countries, you're talking about around 16%. Ours is 44%. It doesn't mean we eat more than any other continent. Income levels are low, and food prices are also very high in our part of the world. You are in Ghana, and we are living examples of how high food price can be. So what did all of this do for us? Of course, colonization also left some positive gains for us in terms of infrastructure, right? And the infrastructure that was left for us was not infrastructure that connect Africa to Africa. It's infrastructure that essentially connect Africa to the rest of the world. So, and that is why it's easier traveling between Africa and the rest of the world than traveling within Africa. And it's more expensive because Africa was not designed to serve Africa. Africa was designed through colonization to serve the rest of the world. Okay, so all our land ports, air, road, and all of that essentially connect Africa to the rest of the world. And that is why within the African continental free trade is a bit expensive doing intra-regional trade than trade between Africa and the rest of the world. Today in Africa, if you want to ship goods to some countries in Africa, it first has to go to Europe for it to be directed back to Africa. And all of that is cost. So if we are in charge, then we should be looking at designing a system that connects Africa to Africa. The lack of fiscal connectivity, economic linkages, and financial leakages impacts us heavily. So post-colonial era, we are still presiding over the economic structure that was handed over to us. What was that economic structure? It was an economic structure that was driven largely by production and export of primary commodities. Okay, and more than 70% of the export earnings across the continent are still driven by primary products. And in this world, if you are not adding value to your primary products, you are not making margins. The world thrives on margins, and the margins come from value addition. So, and once we continue to ship our raw materials the way we have been doing from colonial times to now, then we should not expect a different outcome. Let's look at the new form of colonization. So physically, colonization, we can say we are done away with that, but a new form of colonization has taken us captive. And this new form of colonization is through unfair trade deals and debt diplomacy. The interesting thing is that whilst our traditional development partners in the last 30 years were exiting because of aid fatigue and the rest of them, there are new entrants on the continent who want a part of this called Africa. And the new entrants are in the form of China, India, Russia, and the rest of them. So the introduction of China, India, Russia, and the rest of them introduces additional complex within the African geopolitics and economic system because they all want their bites from the same continent. Whilst the new entrants want this lady called Africa, our old boyfriends don't want to leave us alone as well. You notice that, right? So you can see how this is playing out at the global level in terms of the global geopolitics and the rest of them. And the only thing is that Africa is the only lady that is yet to discover its value, okay, and assert its value within that space. So if you look at in terms of rating and how much we pay on our debts, in terms of the premium, ours is one of the highest. Of course, it's not peculiar only to Africa, and you can also identify that there are things that we ourselves haven't done quite right, which also doesn't help in terms of our credit rating and the rest of them. And then, so if you look at it, this is from the UN work that was done. If you look at the average cost at which Germany borrows from the same market that Africa borrows from, Germany does so on the average at 1.5%, US is 3.1%, Asia 6.6%, but Africa does so at 11.6%, right? So the continent that is poor, that needs cheaper capital for development spending is rather paying more relative to the advanced countries. And I agree with those who propose that there's a need for us to restructure the global financial system and make it more just and fairer so that we all can participate from that. But the other interesting thing as we go along is for us to soon realize that it's Africa's own money that is lent back to us at these higher costs. Okay, at this higher cost, because more than 60% of Africa's high net worth individuals actually don't keep their money on this continent. Okay, so we make the money here with political, economy, influence, and all of that. The money leaves the continent, goes back to those countries, lent back to us at a higher cost, and then we are always paying the price for it. And yesterday, we had several propositions along this line in terms of how much we spend on our debt servicing and how that is crowding now development spending or priority spending. Without doing something fundamental about this, Africa will only talk about development, and our development would exist in the literature or in the textbooks. So if you look at the debt slavery, if you look at how much leaves the continent in terms of debt servicing, it runs into billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. And if you compare that to our development spending, you can understand why we are unable to build infrastructure, social spending, in terms of spending on education, health, and then social protection is very weak because how much we spend on our debt is quite high. This is also closely linked to Africa's tax system. So we have been advised and encouraged with our own support over the decades to design a tax system that gives comfort to lenders. Gives comfort to lenders. So we have to demonstrate our tax capacity to be able to service our debt so that we can take on more debt. In the process, we have actually impoverished ourselves through higher tax rates. And Africa has one of the highest tax rates in the world. Right? And then again, because if you look at the tax structure as well, when it comes to corporate income tax, we have designed the system in such a way that it favors foreign capital. Okay, it favors foreign capital because a lot of the big businesses are coming from there and all of that. Meanwhile, whilst we are weak and inefficient in terms of corporate income tax, we are being pushed aggressively to rake in more tax revenue through indirect tax handles. Indirect tax handles that affect the poor more and the vulnerable. So if you look at VAT, Africa has one of the highest VAT rates. Of course, in Eastern Europe, VAT rate could be very high because income levels are very high. But then if you look at the kind of VAT system we are operating here, it actually worsens inequality, right? So a lot of African countries have VAT rate as high as 20%, okay? Even though the IMF is saying that the VAT rate in excess of 18%, an additional increase only makes... Yes. Thank you, thank you. On my part, I can assure you the slides will be made available. Thank you. It's now the property of this organization, the conference, so that will be made available. Thank you. Okay, so we do this structure, servicing our debt, billions of dollars exiting the continent. And I agree with those who are saying that our external debt should be serviced in a local currency. Because sometimes our debt servicing itself fuels exchange rate volatility. Right? So, because our generation capacity is in a local currency, our debt servicing obligation in a foreign currency, and anytime we have to meet our debt obligations, our currency suffers at the end of the day. So those are some of the things that we want to take into consideration. All right, so Africa borrows, but Africa is not poor. Okay, Africa is not poor. When you are traveling back to Africa, you see the number of expatriates and all of them who come here. I mean, there's something here, that's why they are coming. If you look at what leaves the continent, and here is not new, we are all familiar with this. If you look at what exits the continent in terms of illicit financial flows and all of that, relative to what comes in by way of debt, foreign direct investment, and portfolio flows, our conclusion, similar to other authors, is that Africa is a net creditor to the rest of the world. So it means that if we'll be able to deal with illicit financial flows and preserve resources here, we could actually end up lending to the rest of the world. And it's the reason I started my presentation by saying that Africa is probably the only continent where water flows upwards. So if you are down there, the water will not come to you. And again, the economic nature that we have designed is such that there is greater upward redistribution of wealth. So we have recorded positive growth in the last couple of decades, but the growth doesn't benefit ordinary Africans. So it benefits just a tiny few, and the rest of them actually leaves the continent. And you can also understand it from this perspective. If you pick factors of production, if you pick land, Africa has land, but increasingly a large portion of our land are no longer going to be in the hands of Africans. Have you noticed that? Okay, there's land grabbing going on the continent. The other factor of production is what we call labor. Africa supplies labor. The reward on labor is very cheap. Okay, the reward on labor is very cheap. Africa is not saving. And because Africa is not saving, Africa is unable to finance its own development. And the capital comes from outside the continent, and the return on the capital is very high. So if you look at return on capital as a factor of production, and you compare that to return on labor, also as a factor of production, return on capital is very high, which goes to outside the country because the capital is coming from outside. And return on labor is very low because we provide the what? The labor. And yesterday, somebody was sharing her perspective from South Africa, the mining, those who work in the mining and the rest of them. The wage bill they command is as small as could be described. So fast forward, Africa has great needs, especially in the area of climate change. So we need financing. We contribute so less to climate change, and yet we bear the brunt of it. And simply because our economic model still relies on the traditional weather dependent and the rest of them. So climate change affects us the more. But if you look at flows to us over the years, we have not gotten enough compensation for climate change we contribute so less to, and yet we bear the brunt of it. And some of these inequalities also affect us. My time is almost up. Yes, in our analysis as well, we realized that colonization has left an entrenched and worsened effect on women empowerment, and then also loss of political influence, of course, based on the patriarchal system that was operated. Also, of course, we had been doing that before, but it was just exacerbated by colonization. Thank you. This is the end of it's a summary of the presentation. I'm sure you'll get a copy of the paper itself and the slides as well, and the conversation will continue. Thank you for your attention.